Alrighty, welcome. This is a new little series I'm doing. It's kind of strips it back to what Built Not Bought used to be, where it was a little bit more information based. No crazy editing in this one. So I'd appreciate it if you comment down below and let me know whether you enjoy this or not, because it does take a lot more of my time, but I think it's people learn a lot more from it. So what we're doing today is building my new motor for the drift car. So it's the RB25. We're forging it, so it's fully stripped down to the block. And we're basically going to go through putting the motor together. So I'm definitely no professional. I'm not even a bloody mechanic. I have everything self-taught, but I have built a couple of motors. So this isn't really an instructional video. It's more about what to expect if you want to find out about what's involved with building an engine, or if you are having a crack on your own, some of the stuff you might run into. So I may miss a few steps, so we'll see how we go. But I have done a couple of engines before that didn't blow up, so that's saying something. So first things first, we got this thing machined. Now, every time you get a block back from the machine shop, you assume it's just bloody mint perfect condition, but you do need to clean it. So I gave it a wash, gave it a degrease, and blew everything out with compressed air. So make sure there's no swarf in any of the oil valleys or anything. First thing first, before you even start building an engine, we'll come over here. There's 5 or 6 things you need to do to prepare before you even start putting things together. So the first thing I want to do is balance the pistons and rods. Now this should be done at a machine shop, and I would have done that if I had more time, but I don't. So luckily I've got some quality pistons from Spool Imports, so they're actually pretty bang on balance. They give you a sheet that tells you the small end and big end weight. But what I want to do is weigh each rod, mark it and write it down from lightest to heaviest, and then do the same for the pistons, because they're all balanced individually, but as a set, they're not balanced together. Now what I want to do is find the variance and kind of match the heaviest piston to the lightest rod and work your way down like that. I'll explain it later once we've got all the numbers, because if you put the heaviest piston with the heaviest rod, you might have 4 grams of balance that's wrong, and that's going to cause harmonics in the driveline. So first thing first, balance anything. I'm not going to do any grinding or make adjustments to that. It's just trying to match it up as best as I can, and hopefully it's within spec. And then after that, we've got to set ring gaps and do a bunch of stuff. So we'll get this done first, and then we'll run through the next thing. Alright, so I've done all the weighing now of the rods and pistons. So what I want to do is find the lightest rod, which is this one. The heaviest rod, there's a couple that, so we've got 1, 2, 3, these are all the same, 4, 5 and 6 heaviest. And then the heaviest piston, which will be this one, probably that one. 1, 2, back to the lightest, 3, 4, 5. And the heaviest piston. So now by doing that, we're going to align the heaviest piston with the heaviest rod. I'll add up all the totals and we'll see what the range is. If it's within 2 grams, then we're pretty safe to do this without any changes. But if you're outside of 2 grams, that's where you start getting a little bit too much difference for the harmonics for the motor. So I'll quickly do that and then we'll see where we're sitting. Alrighty, so I've done all the totals now. So looking at the lowest, we've got a 936, and then the highest one, we've got a 938, which is a 2 gram difference, which means we're in spec. So we can pretty much go forwards. What I'm gonna do now is align those different numbers and basically match that piston to that rod, and then we'll assemble them in that order, then we can start doing ring gaps. All right, the next thing we want to look at now is ring gaps. So this changes depending on your application, and you know you've got a quality set of pistons when it's actually supplied to you in the kit. So the ones I got from Spool Imports come with a list of the application that you want to use and the recommended ring gap. So if the ring gaps are obviously oversized to begin with, but if you get too much compression boost in the cylinder, the ring gaps will actually hit each other and bind up and wreck your bore. So what we got here, the one that I'm selecting is medium boost, which is 15 to 30 pound on E85. And then the top bore ring. So there's a top ring, a second ring, and then your oil seal ring. All right, I just jumped off the phone with Corey. Now he's the engine machinist and he's built a ton of these. So the recommendations that they give, they usually oversize them a bit just to be safe. But he said I'll probably get a little bit of extra blow by that I don't want. So he's given me some more numbers. So it's bore times 4.5 thou, and then you go plus 2 thou on your second ring gap. So I've done the calculations. And we want 15 thou on the top gap and then 17 thou on the second. So there's the 2 here. The top gap at the moment is pretty much bang on that 15, which is mint. It just goes in there. But the second ring needs a bit of a file. So we'll file that down. go through the whole set, and then basically we can assemble the piston to the rod and move on to the next thing, which is, I don't even know what, I think it's testing bearing sizes, so we'll get onto that. That needs a little bit of a grind, so does the top gap. If I get it nice and square, the 15 will go in with a push, but it's not nice, so it needs a tiny bit off it. Yeah, it just goes in. So we'll go over and give it a grind and then recheck it. Alrighty, with the pistons and rods assembled, the next thing we need to do before we start actually putting the motor together is checking the bearing clearances. Now, I did get my machinist to do this with a dial gauge, but we're gonna use some plasti gauge just to double check. So this is basically like a tiny little bit of plasti goo that you put on the crank when it's dry, torque it down, and then take it off, and you'll be able to see how much gap you've got between the bearings and the actual crank. So we've got our main cap bearings here. I'm gonna chuck them in. We can also check end float as well. We'll probably do that when we lube everything up. Throw the thrust washer in and just get a dial gauge and check the end float, so you've got a little bit of play there. But all these bearings go in dry, and we wanna make sure we don't spin the crank when we drop it in when we're doing this test. And then once that's done, we disassemble it, lube everything up properly, and then put it in for good. Alrighty, so we've got a reading here. It's probably hard to see on camera, but it basically smooshes out the piece of plastic gauge. And on the actual packet, there's a little measurement you can check. So that's 2 thou there, which is bang on. You want between sort of 2 to 3 thou of clearance. So I just want to clean the crank now, just blow out these oil galleries, just make sure there's no shit in there. Lube everything up, so you want to engine lube everything, like go overboard with that shit. Put it in wet and torque this cradle down, and then we can check the end float, and then we can start putting pistons in. Okay, a little bit of Googling can go a long way. I found the torque specs. It is quite light actually for these motors, so it's 40 foot-pound, which is about 55 Newton meters. I'm using SP Tools brand new torque wrenches, so these are good because they have 3 different sizes. So they go right from your 1/4 inch up to your 3/8 and 1/2 inch drives, and it's a different range of Newton meters on each one as well, so depending on what you're doing up. Another important thing to remember, when you tighten a bolt, get that torque spec, make sure you mark it. I've got a paint pen here so you don't forget any of the bolts. Make sure it's done properly. Start from the inside, work your way out in each direction. When you're doing a head, we'll get to that. That's got a specific order of torque. So just keep that in mind. And if you have aftermarket studs or bolts like ARPs, they'll have their own separate torque specs. So don't go off the internet for that one. So get this wrapped up, get a dial gauge on there and check the end float, then the pistons can go in. Alrighty, now we're going to start putting the pistons in. So I basically got one of the piston clamps on here. Now with the oil rings, it's something you want to pay attention to as well. Pretty much want to put the gap of the top 2 rings on opposite sides of each other. The oil ring you just kind of mix up into a different position. It's not super crucial where they sit, but I like to put the oil ring at each side of that gudgeon pin there. Also whack the bearings in, grease the shit out of it with some engine assembly lube. Clamp the ring up, and you pretty much want to use the back of a hammer. It's really soft, and give it a nice tap, and then the piston should just slot in and those rings will expand once it goes in the cylinder. I've got RB25 bolts, so they've got their own torque setting, and use some of the lube supplied so that you get an accurate measurement and it doesn't want to bind up on the end of the rod there. So I'll go through and whack all these in, torque these up. The spec on these are about, I think it's 75 foot-pound. So once that's done, pretty much flip it over and we can start looking at putting the head on. Alrighty, now that the bottom end is on, the next thing I want to talk about is oil pump. An issue with RB motors is oiling issues. So first thing is the pump, the second thing is the collar that drives the pump. Now, being a Neo, some of the motors have what's called an N1 pump. I've measured the diameter of this and it is an N1 pump. So it's a good pump, but the issue is the collar. So what they have from factory is a little spline, I don't know if you can see on here, but it's basically got two flat sides. So that's the only thing that connects it to the crank. And if you actually have a look closely, it's only touching on about, not even a quarter. See where that little shiny bit is? That's what's engaging the pump. And it can strip out easily. This one's actually quite worn down. And once your pump strips, you lose oil pressure and it basically explodes your engine. So what I've done, Spool Imports have made a collarless. It's basically a gear driven system. So there's no way that this can strip out, which means you don't have any oil dramas and your motor stays nice and healthy. But to put that on, Corey from Donnelly Engineering had to actually machine down my crank in a lathe and slide a new collar on to match this bit. We basically put these gears in the oil pump, put the backing plate back on, and we can put that onto the motor. Once that's on, we can start looking at putting the sump on as well. So that was definitely an upgrade that needed to be done. It's not a performance thing, but it's a reliability thing to make sure that you protect your engine and everything that you've spent on it. Alrighty, cams. Mike was just chucking on the water pump in front there, so we're just having a little play with some of the front accessories. Now with the head, this is the issue that I got. Similar thing on the 80 series. What you have to do is just shim the head because they don't have hydraulic lifters here. Some of the RB25s do, but the Neos don't. They've got the solid one because at high RPM, the hydraulics can't keep up and it creates a bit of a gap, so it's better to go a solid lifter. But because of that, you need to shim the buckets correctly so that the gap between the cam lobe and the lifter is the right spec, because if it's a little bit too tight on the back side of the lobe, it might be slightly holding the valve open, causing you to lose your compression. So, and if it's the other way around, there's too much of a bigger gap, and every time that the lobe goes round, it kind of bangs onto the lifter and it's gonna cause damage. So the issue I have is I can't get new sets of buckets. And if it's not within spec, you can either tip the valve, which you need to be done at a machine shop to get it all square, or you just go a bigger bucket if the gap's too big. So I'm gonna try and get the spec, check all the shims, and hopefully if it's within spec, we can run these cams. If it's not, I'm just gonna have to put the standard cams back in because that's what this is already set up for, and just have to do this at a later date. So torque them down. I'll do all the engine lube and everything just to assume if it's correct, they can stay in there good to go. But that's pretty much where we're at now, and hopefully, fingers crossed, we can use these ones. Okay, cams are in. I'm just gonna send it. A couple of different specs from what I got off the website was this, but the cams themselves offer a recommended shim size, which is 0.025 millimeters on the intake and 0.3 millimeters on the exhaust. Now what I shimmed was about 0.35 mil on exhaust and 0.02 mil on intake, which is about 2 thou of variance. So that is usually acceptable. So I'm just gonna run it. Worst case, like we might lose a little bit of compression on one of the cylinders, but there really is no other option apart from running the standard cam. So we'll see how it goes on the dyno. If it's just stupidly low on compression, then I'll have to change the cams back over, but I'd rather take that risk and see how we go. So put the valve covers back on, button this up, and then tomorrow morning, start setting all the timing of these gears on the timing belt, and get top dead center found, all that kind of stuff that you need to do. And then it's just hot side, cold side, manifold, and it's ready to go back in the car. So pretty much past halfway now. I'm just going to put all the timing gears together now. So put both the cam gears on, line them up with the marks, and just throw the belt on. Before I do that, I'm just going to check top dead center. So put the crank pulley on. I'll put a feeler gauge in through the spark plug hole here. I should have done this when the head was off, but I forgot. So I'm gonna throw a rod down there and just make sure that the top dead center mark on the harmonic balancer is true top dead center with this piston and rod setup. Once I got that, the belt can go on, and then it's just the rest of the accessories, and then we can do hot side, throw the turbo on, the intake manifold, and just all the hoses and that I have. Try and get it as complete as I can while it's on the stand and everything's easy to access before it goes into the car. So after that, we can put the flywheel on and all the clutch assembly, and it's ready to go back in the car. Okay, legends, we just wrapped up the first episode of a little bit of a technical series. So I'm hoping, if all goes to plan, every couple of weeks we'll throw this in on a Saturday morning where it's just a bit more stripped back. None of the crazy editing and entertainment. It's more for the people who want the information, a bit more of the technical stuff. So please comment down below. Let me know if it's worth my time, because it does take a lot longer, but I think it goes back to what Built Not Bought was. And it keeps all the people that don't really understand much about cars happy with our normal episodes, but for you guys that do understand a bit more about the mechanic side of things, you probably get a bit more out of it. So thanks for watching. Let me know. We'll see you next week.